The fog lay heavy over the winding road, a wet, suffocating shroud that swallowed everything in its path. The forest on either side seemed alive, branches scraping together in whispers, warning, or perhaps mocking, anyone daring to pass. Halleridge was not a town that appeared on most maps. It existed in the spaces between maps, in the memories of those who had lived there, and in the rumors that refused to die. Ethan Blackwood tightened his coat against the chill, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat as he scanned the grey horizon. Beside him, Clara Whitmore walked silently, her steps precise and measured, eyes flicking to the shadows as if the trees themselves might conceal watchers. The pair moved with the quiet confidence of people who had nothing to fear, but also with the caution of those who understood danger intimately. From a distance, the town looked inert, almost frozen in time. Wooden houses leaned slightly, their paint peeling like old scabs. Smoke rose in thin wisps from chimneys, dissolving into the heavy mist. A solitary church steeple pierced the fog, its silhouette stark against the dim sky. Here and there, the faint glimmer of lantern light suggested life, but none stirred outside. Halleridge held its breath. Ethan and Clara's arrival went unnoticed. They did not announce themselves, they did not ask for directions. Their eyes, cold and calculating, measured every shadow, every boarded window, every door that creaked with the wind. In their hands, they carried nothing but the weight of intention. No one in Halleridge would notice them yet, but soon, the town would feel them everywhere, like a chill crawling under the skin. As they approached the first house along the main road, Clara paused, tilting her head to catch a faint sound. The distant clatter of something, or someone, moving. She exchanged a brief glance with Ethan, just enough to convey the silent question. "Did you hear that?" He nodded subtly, adjusting his hat. "They always hear what they're supposed to," he murmured. His voice was soft, but the words carried a certainty that suggested experience, practice, and a disregard for the consequences others might fear. The house before them was small, humble, almost innocuous. Its siding was grey, stained with years of rain. The door sagged on its hinges, a whispering invitation. Clara ran her gloved hand along the surface of the wood, feeling its rough grain, its hidden imperfections. "This will do," she said, almost to herself. Ethan's lips curled in a faint, unreadable expression. They stepped onto the porch together. Their boots made almost no sound on the worn boards, though the forest around them seemed to lean closer, straining to listen. The windows were opaque with dirt and neglect. Behind those walls, no one yet knew that the town's rhythm, the quiet, measured breathing of its inhabitants, was about to change. Ethan's eyes swept the surroundings one more time. "Check the perimeter," he said, and Clara nodded, moving swiftly to inspect the sides of the house. Every detail mattered. Every shadow, every unnoticed gap, every board that might conceal evidence of life, or evidence of absence. They were not thieves, exactly, nor were they murderers in the conventional sense. Their methods were precise, controlled, and deliberate. People disappeared in Halleridge not with a scream, not with a struggle, but quietly, almost naturally. The world would not notice. The neighbors would whisper, but nothing concrete would emerge. That was the way of Halleridge. The silence was as much a part of the town as the fog, the trees, and the worn paths. From the porch, Ethan watched Clara slip behind the house, her movements fluid and silent. The fog curled around her like smoke. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air. Soon, he thought, it will begin. A distant sound drew their attention. The faint bark of a dog, echoing from a property a few houses down. It stopped abruptly, as though the animal had sensed something and reconsidered its world. Clara returned to the porch, her expression unreadable. "All clear," she said. But the calm in her voice belied the undercurrent of danger, the meticulous attention to the smallest details that marked them as predators in a town that had not yet noticed. They entered the house without ceremony. The air inside smelled of old wood, dust, and a hint of decay. The floorboards creaked faintly, as though warning them, but they did not hesitate. Each step was measured, silent, purposeful. Halleridge had been a quiet town for too long. And tonight, that quiet would begin to unravel. Through the windows, the fog pressed in closer, obscuring the world outside. Trees shifted, the wind rustled leaves, but nothing could reach them. Here, in this small, grey house, Ethan and Clara began to establish the rhythm of their presence, the quiet signals that would mark the beginning of the disappearances. And outside, the town remained unaware. Halleridge's residents moved through their routines, unseen, unknowing, and unprepared for the change that had arrived with two strangers in coats and hats. The first disappearances were subtle, almost imperceptible. The residents of Halleridge did not speak of them aloud. They simply noticed, after the fact, that someone was missing. It started with a man who ran the local general store. He had been friendly, smiling, nodding to every passerby. One morning, the bell above the door did not jingle. His coat still hung on the hook inside, his ledger open on the counter. No one saw him leave. No one saw anyone enter. When neighbors finally peeked through the windows, they found only dust and silence. Ethan and Clara watched from the shadows that morning. From the edge of the trees, their eyes followed the movements of those who would vanish. No loud noises, no struggle. The town had no idea what had passed through. "They never fight back," Clara said softly, her gloved hand brushing a fallen leaf. "They let us decide." Ethan nodded, adjusting the brim of his hat. "It's all in the timing. Watch, learn, disappear." The forest around them remained still, as if it were part of the plan. Fog curled between the trees, hiding their approach. A crow cawed somewhere to the north, its harsh call breaking the silence, but even that was swallowed by the weight of the mist. By evening, another resident was gone. A teacher from the schoolhouse failed to return home, and neighbors whispered that she must have left suddenly, perhaps for family in a distant town. No one questioned it. No one looked too closely. Inside the small house that Ethan and Clara had claimed, they worked with precision. Items were arranged neatly, plans laid out like a blueprint. Names, habits, routines, they recorded everything. It was a quiet collection of information, meticulous and deliberate. Each note, each observation, was a step toward the disappearances that would soon ripple through the town. At night, they walked among the paths between houses, unseen and unnoticed. Their coats brushed against the low-hanging branches, their hats tilted to shadow their faces. Sometimes they paused, tilting their heads toward the faint sound of movement, an old dog stirring, the creak of a porch, the murmur of voices behind curtains. Each pause was calculated, each glance measured. The townspeople continued with their lives, unaware. They were polite, quiet, and unassuming. But Ethan and Clara's presence had begun to alter the rhythm of the town. The air itself seemed heavier, the shadows longer. Even the wind carried a sense of something wrong, though no one could name it. A young man who delivered milk along the road vanished next. His cart was found upright, bottles scattered on the ground, but no footprints led away from it. The path through the fog was empty. For those who might have noticed, the incident was dismissed. Perhaps he had taken a new route, gotten lost in the woods. It was easier to assume the ordinary explanation. And all the while, Ethan and Clara observed, noting every detail. Their eyes were trained to detect hesitation, fear, or curiosity in those who crossed their path. They were not cruel for pleasure. They were cruel because it worked, because the town allowed it to. By the end of the week, 3 people had vanished, leaving nothing behind but questions and an unsettling quiet. Windows stared like empty eyes, doors sagged, unhinged from routine streets seemed longer, emptier, as if Halleridge itself were retreating from the pair who had arrived under the cover of fog. Clara looked out a grimy window toward the road, her fingers tracing the condensation on the glass. "They'll notice soon," she said, almost to herself. But by then, it will be too late. Ethan stood behind her, silent. His eyes followed the faint lines of smoke rising from a distant chimney. "They always do," he murmured. "They always think it's someone else's problem." And it was. Halleridge was a town that prided itself on knowing nothing. Its residents had cultivated ignorance like a shield, and it had worked for years. Until now. As night fell, the fog thickened, wrapping the town in a cold embrace. The shadows of Ethan and Clara moved through it, silent and deliberate, tracing the patterns of the town as though they had been there all along. The disappearances were only the beginning. By the time the first star pierced the grey sky, Halleridge had begun to change. A sense of unease settled in, faint and subtle, like the first tremor of an earthquake. No one yet knew why. No one yet knew who was responsible. But soon, they would learn, and the town would remember what silence could allow. Halleridge had begun to shift beneath the fog. The town remained silent on the surface, polite in its routines, but beneath the veneer, something unnatural was taking root. Windows that once glimmered with life now reflected only shadows. Doors closed more tightly. The street seemed narrower, suffocating. Ethan and Clara had established a rhythm. They were no longer just observers, they had become the invisible pulse of the town's new heartbeat. Each disappearance was a calculated move, a piece in a pattern that no one yet saw. Inside the small house, the air was thick with the scent of dust and cedar. Maps of streets, houses, and forest paths covered the walls, marked with tiny symbols, initials, and numbers. Folders of notes lay on tables. Names, routines, jobs, habits. Everything and everyone was catalogued. They never noticed the repetition, Clara whispered, tracing a line from one house to another. They think life is random. Ethan leaned over the table, eyes sharp. And that's why it works. Chaos disguised as routine. They let us in without knowing it. Outside, in the misty streets and winding paths, the first signs of their network began to appear. They moved silently, placing subtle markers. A broken fence here, a light flickering at a window there. Each detail was meaningless to the town, insignificant, but in their hands, it became a map, a guide, a silent signal of control. By nightfall, they had begun to integrate other elements into their system. Anonymous messages slipped under doors, strange objects left on porches, things that unsettled but did not reveal themselves. People questioned, briefly, then dismissed the unease. The town had a history of ignoring shadows. One man, a traveler who had recently rented a small cabin on the outskirts, found his supplies rearranged, a single black feather placed atop his bedding. He laughed nervously. Just the wind, he muttered, but sleep did not come easily that night. Ethan and Clara observed from the trees, noting his reactions. The dark network was not merely about removing people, it was about teaching the town to feel watched, to understand that someone, somewhere, was always aware. Every note, every disappearance, every subtle manipulation built tension, suspicion, and fear. Clara moved silently to a side room, where a small lantern flickered over the pages of a notebook. Names and dates flowed across the paper, alongside coded symbols. Each mark represented a person, a path, a future decision. Her handwriting was precise, almost beautiful, but the content was deadly. Ethan returned from the forest path with a quiet air, holding a small bundle. "The delivery is ready," he said, laying it carefully in the corner. Clara glanced over. The bundle was wrapped tightly, its contents hidden. A human life reduced to measured utility, nothing more. "Tonight, we choose another," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed the thrill, the cold, calculating satisfaction of power. They moved together through the forest again, navigating the fog, the low branches, the uneven ground. Each step was deliberate, each glance careful. They communicated silently, through subtle gestures, a language honed through countless hours of planning and execution. The town had no idea that every leaf, every shadow, every gust of wind could be a signal, a marker, a step closer to disappearance. By midnight, the first signs of panic began to ripple. A neighbor knocked on another door, asking where someone had gone. Another whispered rumors down the street. But by then, it was too late. The dark network was already in motion, a pattern invisible to the untrained eye. Ethan and Clara returned to their house, their movements smooth, their expressions unreadable. The fog hugged the ground, hiding their path, but the town felt the weight of their presence nonetheless. Halleridge was learning fear, without ever knowing from whom. And in the quiet of the house, amid maps, folders, and coded notes, they planned the next steps. Each decision, each calculation, pushed the town further into the shadows. The disappearances were not random, they were precise, deliberate, a demonstration of control, a warning whispered without words. By the time dawn threatened to break the fog, Halleridge had changed imperceptibly. Windows reflected shadows differently. Streets seemed narrower, quieter. The town was breathing, but unevenly, as though anticipating something it could not name. And somewhere in the house, Ethan and Clara sat, side by side, planning, observing, waiting. Their network had begun, unseen, unstoppable, and the town's ignorance ensured that every move they made would go unnoticed until it was far too late. The fog in Halleridge had grown heavier, pressing into the cracks of the town like an uninvited guest. Streets seemed narrower, trees leaned closer, and the faint echoes of life had begun to feel wrong, off. The town's residents sensed it, though they could not name it. Something had changed. It started with small, almost meaningless details. A gate left ajar, a window unlatched, a piece of cloth snagged on a fence. No one paid much attention at first. Humans have a way of ignoring the faintest signs until they cannot ignore them any longer. Then the first bodies, or what remained of them, were found. A hunter, venturing into the northern woods, stumbled over a partially buried bundle beneath the mist and fallen leaves. The discovery was enough to shock him into silence, but not enough to mobilize the town. He reported it hesitantly to the sheriff, who, in turn, brushed it off as a tragic accident. Inside the bundle, remnants of a human life were barely recognizable. The fog and decay had done their work. Only the faint outline of a shape, the hint of clothing, remained. The sheriff frowned, his brow tight. Maybe it's an animal, he muttered to himself. But even as he said it, a small, gnawing unease settled over him. Ethan and Clara watched from the tree line, silent and unseen. They had anticipated the discovery, of course, and it played into their plan. The town would begin to feel the edges of fear, the creeping anxiety of something wrong, but it would not yet understand who, or what, was responsible. Clara's eyes scanned the perimeter, fingers brushing the foggy air. "They'll talk," she said quietly. "But they won't see us." "Not yet." Ethan nodded. "And by the time they realize, it will be too late." The pattern continued. A child's doll left abandoned on a porch, a bicycle chained to a fence but missing its rider, footprints that led nowhere. Halleridge was beginning to wake to the reality that the town itself was not safe. Shadows stretched longer, winds whispered differently, and the residents began noticing things they had once ignored. At night, the house on the hill became a hub of activity. Ethan and Clara moved with precision, cataloging their finds, arranging their next steps. Maps were updated with locations of remains and hints, cross-referenced with their growing knowledge of the townspeople's routines. Every discovery, every misstep, was absorbed into their silent network of control. The sheriff, an aging man with creased hands and a cautious mind, called a meeting. A handful of townspeople gathered in the dimly lit hall, faces tense, whispers low. No one dared speak loudly. The body in the forest, the missing milkman, the teacher, these incidents were not connected, at least not in any visible way. Yet, something hovered over the room like smoke, invisible but suffocating. "They say they saw something," muttered one resident, avoiding eye contact. "Near the woods. Movement. Shapes." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Be cautious. Don't jump to conclusions. If it's nothing, we don't want to spread panic." But it was not nothing. Halleridge had begun to taste fear. The fog seemed thicker, the shadows darker, and the silence heavier. The edges of the town were no longer safe. Every unexplained disappearance, every bundle of remnants, every unsettling detail had begun to form a web the residents could not yet see. From their house, Ethan and Clara monitored the town through windows obscured by grime and mist. Their eyes followed patterns of movement, noting curiosity, suspicion, and fear. The first signs of panic were subtle. Hurried glances, whispered warnings, doors locked more firmly at night. The town was beginning to react exactly as intended. Clara's lips curled into the faintest smile. "They feel it," she whispered. "The fear is starting to settle in." Ethan adjusted his hat, the brim shadowing his sharp eyes. "And it will grow. It always does." Outside, the fog continued to thicken, swallowing pathways, hiding secrets, and casting doubt over every observation. The first tangible evidence of their presence had been found, and yet the perpetrators remained unseen. Halleridge was learning, slowly, that the town's own routines had become a playground for those who knew how to manipulate its silence. By dawn, the small hall where the townspeople had met was quiet again. Whispers lingered in empty corridors, questions hung like smoke, and the unease had taken root. The dark network that Ethan and Clara had woven around the town was no longer invisible. It had begun to imprint itself upon the psyche of Halleridge, and the town would never feel safe again. Halleridge was no longer the town it had been. The fog, once a soft veil, now pressed like a living weight into every corner of the streets. Residents moved with caution, their eyes darting to shadows and empty porches. Whispers of disappearances had grown louder, and a subtle hysteria took root. Children were kept inside, doors were bolted, and the smallest sounds set nerves on edge. Ethan and Clara thrived in the chaos. They were no longer mere observers or planners. They were hunters, orchestrating a sequence of fear and control with surgical precision. Every action, every disappearance, every subtle manipulation had taught the town to fear itself. That night, the first deliberate confrontations occurred. A man returning from the distant woods found himself followed. At first, he thought it a trick of the fog, the branches, the shadows. But footsteps mirrored his own, quiet, deliberate, keeping pace without pause. He turned, heart hammering, and glimpsed two figures slipping between the trees. Coats dark, hats tilted low, eyes glinting in the dim light. Ethan and Clara communicated without words, a silent choreography perfected over years of meticulous planning. They approached, just enough to unsettle, just enough to demonstrate the omnipresence of fear. The man froze, panic prickling at his skin, knowing instinctively that these were not ordinary townsfolk. Meanwhile, within the town, police and curious neighbors struggled to connect the dots. The first tangible clue, a piece of fabric snagged on a branch, a shoe left abandoned, was dismissed as coincidence by most. But the patterns were deliberate, calculated. Every disappearance, every signal, every encounter pushed Halleridge closer to paralysis. Clara observed from the tree line as Ethan silently circled behind a second target, a woman delivering letters. He moved like a shadow, precise, careful. Clara's hands were tucked into her coat pockets, but her eyes tracked every motion, analyzing, calculating, confirming the subtle psychological hold they had established. The first corpse discovered in the forest had been enough to unsettle the town. Now, with deliberate threats and shadows stalking the streets, Halleridge began to experience the next stage of terror. The realization that someone could strike at any time, anywhere, and the town was powerless to stop them. Inside their house, Ethan and Clara catalogued each observation. Their notebooks were filled with names, routes, schedules, and habits. Maps were marked with tiny symbols indicating what had been taken, what remained, and what would soon vanish. Every day, the network expanded, subtle and invisible to anyone outside their calculated control. Yet they did not act blindly. Every movement was deliberate, every fear orchestrated to perfection. A sudden disappearance here, a shadow there, a muffled sound that could be dismissed as wind, all were tools in their psychological arsenal. The town's terror was as much a part of their plan as the bodies they collected. At the edge of the forest, a young couple noticed footprints that led to nowhere. They exchanged nervous glances, whispering theories that no one dared voice aloud. The air seemed charged, each rustle of leaves a threat, each gust of wind a potential signal of danger. And somewhere in the fog, Ethan and Clara observed, their expressions unreadable, moving as one, the perfect embodiment of invisible menace. By dawn, Halleridge had learned the language of fear. Windows reflected shadows that did not belong, doors hid what might be behind them, and streets seemed narrower, more treacherous. The residents had begun to understand, dimly, that someone, or something, controlled the rhythm of their lives. But Ethan and Clara were always one step ahead. Each disappearance, each subtle intimidation, each manipulation of shadows tightened their control over the town. Halleridge was ensnared, and there was no escape for those who had already felt the weight of their presence. Clara's lips curled into a faint smile as she reviewed the latest notes. "They think they can predict us," she whispered. "But they are already trapped." Ethan adjusted his hat, the brim shadowing his eyes. "And the next ones won't even know fear until it's too late." The fog swallowed their figures as they moved silently through the trees, disappearing from view. The town slept uneasily, unaware that the predators who haunted its streets had already begun the final stages of their orchestration. By midday, reports of missing persons, strange shadows, and unexplained noises circulated quietly. The town's pulse was irregular, fastened in a grip of tension that neither police nor residents could understand. Halleridge was no longer safe, and the invisible hunters who had arrived in silence were shaping its reality with methodical cruelty. Halleridge had grown silent in a way that was almost unnatural. The town no longer slept restlessly. It waited, tense and alert, as though sensing that the long shadow that had fallen over it was about to be revealed. Ethan and Clara moved with the same calm precision they had always exhibited, but tonight the air carried a different weight. The fog seemed heavier, denser, clinging to every branch, every street, every corner. The network they had built, the web of fear and control, was nearing its culmination. Inside their house, the atmosphere was tense. Maps and notebooks were spread across the tables, each symbol, each name, a testament to the reach they had exerted over the town. Clara studied the papers, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. Ethan stood by the window, the fog pressing against the glass, his reflection pale in the dim light. "They're closing in," Clara whispered, almost to herself. "The police. They've started connecting the dots." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this moment, but it carried a weight he could not entirely dismiss. "I expected nothing less," he said, his voice low, measured. "And now it ends as it must." By midnight, the first signs of the authorities appeared. Police vehicles crept along the foggy streets, lights dimmed, cautious. Officers moved with precision, scanning the woods, the houses, the paths between them. Halleridge's residents watched from shuttered windows, hearts hammering in the oppressive silence. Ethan made his decision swiftly. He knew capture would be inevitable. He turned to Clara, voice steady. "Go. Survive. Make them think they've won." Clara hesitated, but the sharp certainty in his eyes left no room for argument. Ethan moved to the edge of the porch, the mist curling around his boots. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though considering the weight of the world and the inevitability of the end. Then he stepped forward. A gunshot echoed softly in the fog, muffled by distance, yet unmistakable in its finality. Ethan lay motionless, the mist swallowing his form. The shadow that had haunted Halleridge so long had vanished, leaving only the echoes of fear. Moments later, officers breached the house. Clara, calm and composed, raised her hands. There was no struggle, no resistance. She had anticipated this moment as well, and she accepted it with the same measured calm that had guided every step of their dark enterprise. Inside the house, the remnants of their network remained. Notebooks, maps, coded symbols, evidence of the meticulous planning, the disappearances, the orchestration of terror. Officers collected the materials, their faces pale with the realization of the scale, the precision, and the coldness with which the town had been manipulated. Outside, Halleridge breathed unevenly. The fog began to lift, revealing streets scarred by fear and suspicion. The town's residents emerged cautiously, whispering, pointing, and piecing together the fragments of what had occurred. The horror was real, and its architects, Ethan Blackwood and Clara Whitmore, had left their indelible mark. Clara was taken into custody, her eyes steady, her posture unbroken. She offered no apologies, no explanations beyond what was necessary. Her mind had been trained for control, her movements for precision. But even she could not escape the consequences of their actions. Halleridge slowly began to recover. Windows reopened, doors unlocked, and children ventured outside once more. Yet the shadows remained, embedded in the memory of the town, a subtle reminder that fear, once sown, could never be entirely erased. The fog dissipated, the streets lay bare, and the town exhaled as though releasing a long-held breath. But in the hearts of its residents, a quiet unease lingered, a knowledge that Halleridge had been touched by darkness, that the meticulous cruelty of two strangers had altered their reality forever. And somewhere, behind bars, Clara Whitmore waited, unbroken, watching, planning, a testament to the fact that the shadow had never truly vanished, it had only changed form. Halleridge would remember. The story ended, yet the fear remained.